Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV and my private membership club, SFO Continuity. Today, how to incorporate next gen across the enterprise. I've been looking to cover this subject for a long time, and I think that for families of wealth, business owning families, families with philanthropic and foundational interest, and of course, families with a family office, nothing may be more integral to continuity of the family than, I would say, the answer to this question, so to speak, or topic, but there really is no one set answer. Each family is different. But we have a special guest today that has the experiences of having seen hundreds and hundreds of families go through some of these challenges and opportunities generationally, and sharing ideas and stories will be valuable to us all. And that special guest, for the first time on my show, I've known her for years and have been a fan from afar. We're very fortunate to bring in Susan Schoenfeld. She is the CEO of Wealth Legacy Advisors, and uniquely for the topics that we're talking about, is a JD and an LLM of taxation, a CPA, and an MBA. Someone on the show, Susan, apparently not Angelo, is pretty well educated.
I do have a lot of alphabet soup after my name, yes, Angelo.
Well, nonetheless, a pleasure to have you on. We have a lot to discuss, and why don't we, without further fanfare, and the audience cannot accuse me today of a little clickbait in the title, because we're going to get right to that kind of question and comment in the title. Susan, we'll start off more macro on the question, and then we'll dive deeper into the micro aspects of that question. But again, Susan, how would incorporate next gen across the enterprise?
So for me, the reason I love this title is because we didn't say across the family business or across the business, but we're referring to the family's potentially vast universe as an enterprise. So that can encompass the operating business if they still have one. It can encompass their, if they've had their liquidity event, it can encompass their family limited partnership that's now investing in private equity. It can encompass the family's philanthropic activities, whether it's a family foundation or other philanthropic joint effort. And it can also encompass the family's asset side of their balance sheet, whether it's the family vacation compound or it's the boat. A family I worked with not that long ago had just had a senior member of the family pass away, and the family was all up in arms about what do we do with Dad's boat and the island in the Caribbean and the all the various toys and trappings that were Dad's, and now we have to unravel all of that. So a family enterprise can encompass all of these things and is really ripe for all sorts of these conversations as assets pass to the next generation, as in the story I just told, or hopefully in anticipation of that long before there's a transition of wealth.
Of course. And the word next gen could be a little bit misleading. In theory, I could be the wealth principal who holds on to everything, and I'm 91 years old. My next gen, my son or daughter, or multiple of them, could very well be in their mid-60s. So I thought about that. But the reality is, we all make the assumption more of rising generation implying younger, but we'll both share. The reality is, the example that was a little comical that I just made, it can absolutely be all too real. So next gen actually is most applicable. I mean, I agree with you. I probably break it down to kind of 3 buckets from across the enterprise: business, family office, of course, I have to put that in, and effectively foundation, philanthropy, to me, is being kind of a big 3. How, and I indirectly tackled it a second ago, but how age dependent, meaning if the child is 9 months old, that's obviously maybe too young. But how young is too young? Does it depend on the child, the culture, and the family?
That's a great question. And I always say that the ideal time to start thinking about and talking about it and educating about the family's wealth is yesterday. And you can't start yesterday, so start today. And yes, 9 months may be a little young to have a conversation about your wealth management and your investment portfolio. But 9 months is not too young to start teaching a youngster about your family's culture and who are we as a family. And crafting that family story is a really important step for a family in identifying itself both internally to rising members of the family and also externally. How do we want the world at large to see us, if at all? Many families prefer to fly under the radar. Other families like to have a wing in at their hospital named after them. Neither choice is right or wrong, but it should be embarked on intentionally and thoughtfully. So yes, some techniques with a 9-month-old might be, and yes, I understand that was said in jest, but it really is not too young to start teaching the family story. Kids love repetition. Kids love bedtime stories. And if you start with once upon a time, grandma and grandpa came over to America on a boat and invested and built a business, which they just sold. And now it's, some large mega corporation. Those are the kinds of stories that the wealth creator generation, I believe, needs to thoughtfully and intentionally craft so that they can be told and repeated in a consistent way to bolster that sense of family identity and family culture. So that's certainly one way you can start with even a toddler. Another way you might deal with someone of that age. I had a client a long time ago who was an inheritor of wealth and shared with me a story that I still tell to this day because it really resonated. She said, Grandma and Grandpa created this nest eggs, this remember the goose who laid the golden egg? Well, she said, she used that. We've got this golden egg that we inherited from my grandparents, and my job is to steward and nurture that egg, not bust it open and take out all the coins in the piggy bank, so that I can in turn pass it on to you and you can be responsible stewards. And at the end of the day, Angelo, families of wealth care most about raising competent and confident stewards of wealth and not the proverbial trust fund dependent offspring. And so there are many, many techniques, which I'm sure we'll cover in the course of today's conversation, at all sorts of age appropriate ways. As the kids get older, the notion of using an allowance to teach kids budgeting, number one, also really critical to teach them the concept of wants versus needs is a really important lesson for the rising generation of wealth. And do you really need to have that new iPhone, or do you really need to have that new video game or bike or car for that matter? Or is that something you want? And so the teaching the concept of wants versus needs is something that parents can do, again, with young children, maybe not 9 months, but certainly little ones, as they start to develop their sense of where do I belong in this world and how do I interact with people in my universe.
Lot to digest. And of course, being a little in jest with 9 months old. But I remember reading that I believe the average child by, let's go with age 3, is exposed to about 3,000 words, but above average performers, at least academically, I believe the number is closer to 5,000 words. And it does not have to be strictly from a parent, relative, or acquaintance, although that probably is optimal. They've even shown that hearing it in recordings and music and audiobooks and the like. So I know some of you may have chuckled at our comment, but noticed how after the first part of it, we're actually being a little serious. Now, you said a couple of things there, and practically everything you said, especially at a younger age, another irony, I don't think those things are taught in any school. Now, they may be inherently learned through interaction with others, but it's not something like school is teaching per se the things that you're talking about. So it's the responsibility of the family for their lineage, for their continuity. They could afford the best schools, they understand that, but they need to take responsibility. If you're going to have a child and family, you want them to be optimal for them. And if you really care about continuity and character in the family, not just what you say, but your actions and what you do are obviously going to be very, very important. You did use the word steward. I do not disagree with you, but to be a little contrarian, let's go a little back and forth on that. Because I'm thinking of some of my experiences, and the word steward was scary to some, let's go with rising generation, meaning it feels like an obligation, it feels like a pressure, whereas I don't know if they have the right education and grounding in the family legacy. Some of the things we're talking about now, most families, even of wealth, don't really do that. So that coming into age and it being a steward and feeling the pressure of not failing may be an albatross of wealth.
Without a doubt, I have seen that, the concept of inheritor's guilt, where the younger generation says, I didn't do anything to earn this money. My parents or my grandparents left it to me, and they feel guilty and they feel unworthy. And then perhaps they end up giving it away to a charity that would have caused their grandparents to roll over in their grave. And I'm not for a second suggesting that donating to charity is a bad thing. I think it's a beautiful thing, but it needs to be done. I'm of the belief that it needs to be done thoughtfully, intentionally, and with a plan. It needs to be done to heal the world. It needs to be done to make you feel good. It needs to be done to set an example for others. All the reasons that people give their money away are all positive things for society, but the wrong reason is because someone inherited it and felt guilty about it, so just wanted to dump it. That, to me, is the wrong reason to give away money. And so, yes, without a doubt, the teachings, the constant reinforcement of the family culture, and the notion of who are we as a family? What do we stand for? What does it mean to be a member of the Robles family? And that is should be taught to not just rising members of the family, but also to incoming members of the family. Perhaps there's been a marriage, and that person is by definition from a different culture, whether it's from a different ethnicity or simply a different wealth culture. So you've got those sorts of considerations as well. And it is, I'm of the belief that you need to shine the light on these conversations. The number of people who have said to me, my children have no idea that we're wealthy. And I'm sitting in their mansion overlooking, whatever.
And all that.
And I sort of hold out my hands and I say, really? And one guy actually came back to me and he said, well, yes, it's a nice house, but it's the smallest house on the block. And I said, well, that may be, but it's a really nice block. And your son is 17 and he's going off to college next year. And while it is possible that his college roommate may be from a similar economic background, it's also possible that his roommate might be a scholarship student from a much more modest background. And you need to equip your son with the information and the confidence, frankly, to be able to address those sorts of things. And you laugh, but it's true. We live in a world where the internet provides the younger generation with infinite access to information. And so they look up routinely, they Zillow your home to see what it's worth. They look you up on Google. They can see what charities you donate and what galas you went to and how much you donated. If you work for a public company, they can look you up on Edgar and see your salary. They can look up any number of things about you, especially if you're even remotely close to being a public figure. So pretending that wealth doesn't exist is really doing your kids and grandkids a disservice, because you're subtly telling them that you don't trust them to share information that they already have. Because even if miraculously they didn't look you up on the internet, well, their buddy at school probably did.
Yeah.
Or your brother-in-law told his kids, and now at Thanksgiving dinner, when, after dinner, the adults are all having brandy and cigars or whatever, and the kids are upstairs playing. Well, guess what? Your kids now know. And so pretending it doesn't exist is really sending a message that you don't trust them with critical information about their core identity.
100%, which relates to another word that you said. It probably my initial foundation to start with, and that word is culture. So I guess I would define it, like most people, the making of collective values, beliefs, and purpose goals that lead to a social construct, I suppose, is culture. And I guess there's no right or wrong culture, and marrying it and others that have different beliefs might even be additive to cause the family to think differently and adapt. Although that gets to be a little bit of a complex subject. How do you deal with the families and the rising generation on understanding culture, but having their own persona and beliefs as they earn it that may be different? And that's a balance that you must have to deal with all the time.
You're right. It is all the time. And to me, the best possible approach is invite the rising generation into those family meetings or family enterprise meetings or family foundation meetings or family office meetings or family council meetings, however the family gets together to discuss the business of the family, whether there's a family business or not. Depending on their age and depending on their maturity level, invite these rising up-and-comers into the meeting, perhaps even form a junior advisory council so that they have a little bit of a voice. And maybe or maybe not, they may not yet have a vote because they're not of age. But first of all, they get to learn. They get to sit there and listen and learn and absorb and hopefully speak and feel heard, because at the end of the day, if they're not included and they don't feel engaged in the family governance system, whatever that may be in a given family, how can you expect them to be governed by it if they weren't part of it to begin with? So number one, invite them into the meeting, even if, again, they don't have a vote, but they do get a voice, and hear what they have to say, because they are going to be the future leaders of the family. And if they've got a different priority than your generation does, at least hear it, at least have a conversation about it. I worked with a family not too long ago where the younger generation, and they were, oh God, I think they were like fourth or fifth generation wealth. And the young people were in their late 20s, early 30s. And they were very, very interested in impact investing. As many young people are, they care about healing the world, and they don't necessarily care as much whether their investment comes out of the pocket labeled philanthropy or it comes out of the other pocket labeled the investment pocket. But very often they're interested in impact investing. And the senior generation, the uncle in this case, was so firmly and dead set against it that he wouldn't even engage in having a conversation. And ultimately, what you could see happening is this is a family office that is destined to fail, because the younger generation is not engaged. They don't feel heard. And I'm not saying the uncle had to put 100% in impact, but at least engage and have a conversation and maybe explain why you don't like it. Maybe the right investment hasn't come along, but you've been actively investigating it. Or maybe philosophically you're against it. What have you? The circumstances are almost irrelevant. The the point is to sit down and have a conversation about it and say, I hear you, and have that young person feel heard. Because again, I know I'm repeating, but I think it bears repeating. If the younger generation doesn't feel heard and doesn't feel that they are participatory, how do you possibly expect them to engage later and to feel governed by it? And the number of families that have subsequently come to me and said, I can't get my kids involved in the family enterprise. Well, maybe you haven't tried. And so it is, again, as I said earlier, the ideal time to start is yesterday, but you can't start yesterday, so start today.
And the dual challenge in what you're describing, especially if it's more in a family business, but relates to the other two or others you could think of that I mentioned, could be nepotism and earning it. How is that balanced, especially if there's other branches of the family and if there's non-family member yet talented executives and people? Boy, this is a tough one. How do you deal with that?
Are you talking, Angelo, about leadership succession, or are you talking about the actual inheritance? Because I have two different responses.
I'm usually more of leadership.
Okay. So I actually have, I've written extensively on leadership succession in family offices, and I like to break things down into easily digestible bites. So for leadership succession in a family office, I employ a 3-step process. Step number 1 is, not surprisingly, to identify who that successor is going to be. And in some cases, you're right, it can and often is outright nepotism, but that doesn't necessarily check all the boxes, because you may have multiple children, you may have nieces and nephews, you may have stepchildren, blended family situations. There's any number of situations. I worked with a family about 10 or 15 years ago where I was engaged to help them identify a future leader amongst the next generation and help develop them. And so that inquiry was limited only to the next generation. But first of all, you have to pick not just somebody who won the lucky gene pool, but also someone who is willing and able to take that on. Maybe they are an artist at heart and have no interest in business. Or maybe they're a very successful business person and don't have time or interest in serving in the family enterprise. There's any number of reasons why the direct offspring may not be the suitable choice. And then you go into the situation where you look at the longtime faithful CFO or some other key employee in the family enterprise, and you consider who that ought to be. And you do that early. You don't do it a day before you're going to retire. And of course, I live here in Manhattan, and the proverbial, step out onto Fifth Avenue and get hit by a bus sort of thing is of course always a risk. And not very long ago, we came out of a pandemic where any number of unforeseen situations could have arisen. So you do need to engage in this early and have a conversation often, and you don't keep it a secret, like in the TV show Succession, where to his dying day he didn't disclose who his chosen successor was. Have those conversations. Make sure, number 1, they want it, and number 2, they're able to do it, and number 3, they're engaged. And so that's step 1, is to choose your successor. Step 2 is to groom the successor. And that is hopefully a decades-long endeavor where you're constantly giving them the opportunity to, so to speak, learn at the knee of the master, and to continue learning as it goes along, and you can slowly increase their responsibilities until they have enterprise-wide responsibilities. And step 3 is to communicate the choice of that successor to not only to that successor, but to all the stakeholders. And by all the stakeholders, it's other family members, whether they are active or passive investors in the business. It's also key employees, it's key customers, it's key vendors. It's really all the stakeholders. And at the end of the day, the biggest step, which is not part of my 3 steps, but the very biggest step, is have that seminal moment where the wealth creator, let's say, has a retirement party and steps down and officially passes the torch to the successor. And in some cases, it might be upon death. In other cases, there might be a retirement party. And then the challenge is finding some role for the senior members so that they still have an office to go to and still feel important and all of those sorts of things. So there's a very important step-by-step process to it. And I think about the British royal family. So Queen Elizabeth, obviously, step 1, her successor was chosen. Everyone knew it was going to be now King Charles. Step 2 is groom the successor. So she had 70 years to groom him to become king. Her father, so like many of us during the pandemic, I binge watched The Crown. And during the first season, when Queen Elizabeth's father knew that he had a terminal disease but chose not to tell anyone, he missed a golden opportunity to train her and teach her what it took to become the monarch. And at least if fiction is to be believed, she went out and educated herself when the time came. But how much more helpful would it have been had he sat her down and said, Elizabeth, I've got a medical condition. Pretty soon you're going to ascend to the throne. And here's some things you ought to know. And he never did that. And so she had 70 years of really demonstrating for King Charles how to become the monarch. And then, of course, the third step was communicating the choice. And in that case, we all knew that he was going to be the king after she passed, but she also left certain instructions about Queen Camilla and how she wanted her referred to and how she wanted certain things after she passed. And so the steps in leadership succession in a family office or family business, as ultimately the British royal family is a giant family business, it can be at that level, or it can be your own little family office of just, mom and dad and 2 kids. It's really the same discussion. You need to be thoughtful and intentional about who you choose and groom them continually.
Susan, wearing is the head that wears the crown. Not everyone desires to be the leader, a decision maker that may feel, for lack of a better word, burden. Although you and I may look at that as being an honor and may enjoy that process, not everyone does. And also you have the issue, depending on the size of the family, the business interest and or other interests like investments or AKA through the family office, in terms of equitable distribution, for lack of a better word. Now we're getting into the weeds of the reality of challenges with families, why they often, sadly, could have intra-family litigation and lead to problems of the wrong decisions, heirs not being ready to assume leadership. And I think you might have touched on some of these things leading up to this all-important question. This is why I prefer to deal with family office structures, best practices of the family office, and investing. Although maybe someone in your role finds that those are the real tough things. To me, those are easy. It's these topics that are the real challenge in many families, and you've seen it for decades.
Indeed. And you're right. The family office structures, that's a finite calculus. You can put it down on a page and choose the structure that makes the most economic sense for a family. The taxes, all of those sorts of things are very easily calculable. The human side of families. So, as you know, I prefer not to use the term the soft side because I actually do agree that these are the hardest topics of all. But the human side of the family dynamic side of working with a family and helping them work through challenges that have come up in their family enterprise is, to me, the most interesting area of all, because at the end of the day, I rest my head on my pillow asking, did I add value today? Did I make a difference? And in the work that I do with families, I have such enormous satisfaction because I know I made a difference. I worked with a family right before the pandemic, and my mandate from the senior generation was, I want you to restore harmony to all my offspring. And there were, he was prolific. There were 6 children. They were probably 50 years old. So, we all talk about kids. But I am so proud that at the end of our first family meeting, they spontaneously engaged in a group hug. And it was so gratifying. I still get chills when I think about that moment when this family who was really at odds, and it turned out that as the mental health people call it, the presenting issue was not at all what the real issue was about, and we kept digging deeper. Mixing metaphors, sort of below the surface of that iceberg, until we got to where the real challenge was. And we addressed it head on. And what ended up happening, as I said, was that spontaneous group hug that still warms my heart.
And I was going to bring it up later, but I think it could be a good segue now. And you also already mentioned it. Everything we just described gets more complicated in today's modern world with marriage, divorce, blended families, which are, again, way more common than, say, 40 or 50 years ago. Married-ins, etc., stepchildren. They're, again, like you said, in certain things in structure, taxation, investments, in my opinion, it is more black and white. And it's a little more complicated than that. But in this arena that we're talking in now, there really is no right or wrong answer. How do you address the issues that we have been building into when it's a modern world? There's a reason why that TV show that was so popular a couple of years ago, but
Modern Family,
blended.
Indeed.
Now we're talking realities. How do you address that?
Oh, that's where it gets interesting. And the common term that I've heard used for the spouses of our children is the outlaws rather than the in-laws. And what I counsel families is, don't forget that those outlaws that you're disparaging are going to be the parents of your grandchildren. And so leave them out of the family discussions about culture and values and governance at your peril, because they're going to teach your grandchildren that you're not an inclusive person and this family is not inclusive, and the family's stated values don't necessarily represent all of the family, and all of these things. There's going to be animus involved. And so, yes, if you're having a family meeting and part of the meeting is to discuss the family business of which the outlaws are not participating, then maybe they don't get invited to certain sessions of the family meeting. But you bet, when you're discussing, as I said, the family's mission, vision, values, who are we as a family, crafting our family story, deciding who we're going to benefit with donations or grants from our family foundation or donor advised fund, you bet you want them involved.
100%. And that goes back a little bit to what I brought up earlier with culture and the old adage from Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I feel like I agree. I'm a strategy guy at heart, but before that, leading into that, is the value of culture and the things that we're talking about and being inclusive. And the dynamics are changing. Unlike the royal family, the example that you gave, that is somewhat of a set structure for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years relative to the oldest child and how it gets complicated in today's world with male and female as well. That's a little bit of an era of the past. The world is changing. And there's different dynamics now. It's not necessarily the oldest. It's not necessarily the oldest male. It's a different world. And I could argue that families that are not going to be adaptive, and this goes into perhaps a deeper discussion from patriarchy to matriarchy. And if you really look at the history of old families, and I've been to Europe multiple times, I'm sure you have as well, really the lineage, a lot of these houses of these great families going back often 500 to 700 to 800 years old, really it's often the lineage of the matriarchy when you look at it in France and other countries that has a longer bloodline and lineage. Now this gets to be both a sensitive and an interesting topic. So although I'm talking about 500 to 700 years ago, bringing it now into today's world, it's ever more important and timely. How do you navigate that minefield?
It's a very interesting question that you've asked. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the so-called great wealth transfer. And everyone's talking about the great wealth transfer as the baby boomers leaving their assets to their children. But there's a great wealth transfer that's happening before that. And that is the actuarial lifespan of males is typically slightly shorter than females. So the initial or the current great wealth transfer is really that the matriarchs have become the family leader and the family elder. And particularly, I would say a generation older than mine, they were not necessarily, the wives were not necessarily equipped for that role. They were the dutiful corporate wife. They were the one who raised the family. They were not necessarily encouraged to be out in business. My generation and the generations who came after me are a different story. But I still remember about 15 or 20 years ago, I had a client who exactly fit that profile. Sadly, her husband passed away and she became the matriarch of the family and had zero experience and zero training to do it. And when she would travel to New York for our meetings, she took the church bus because she didn't think she could afford to take a plane. And she had hundreds of millions of dollars and just had never been equipped because her husband took care of everything for her. And so, yes, the current matriarchy is facing substantial challenges, whether it's from their husbands passing away, or as you said, because of the propensity for divorces. And so a lot of women are now, even if they weren't the wealth creator and their husband was, they've now got a whole lot more wealth than they ever were personally responsible before, whether they were working or not. And so you've got all of these sorts of issues and how you, as an advisor, how you approach that is, first of all, you need to be sensitive to what they already know. And by they, it could be, right now I'm talking about the matriarch becoming the head of the family, but it can just as well go the other way, where the matriarch was the wealth creator or the inheritor, and now her husband is the one. But either way, you've got people who maybe haven't been equipped over the course of their lifetimes and now have this influx of sudden wealth. And the advisors to those people need to be very sensitive to the feelings of inadequacy that might happen, and also be supportive. And I like to take this sort of Cyrano de Bergerac approach where I whisper in their ear and bolster them up so that they can attend the board meeting or they can attend the family foundation meeting and feel confident and informed and go in there and not feel inadequate. And so it is really a continual lifelong education is ultimately the answer.
Of course. And a little bit of my experience is if there is a so-called patriarchy and matriarchy, the value of the matriarchy in terms of the upbringing of children and the installment of character, of morals, and often it may be a religious grounding. My experience in traveling the world and knowing 2,000 family offices and a lot of families behind it, that is often driven by the matriarchy. And that is an incredibly valuable, I could argue more valuable than really anything else. We could do a 2-hour discussion about that because personally I find it a very, very fascinating subject. And perhaps we'll save that one for 6 months down the road. So audience, stay tuned.
2.0, yes.
And related to that, I was going to bring up, and I kind of been hinting at it because I haven't mentioned it, the value of character. And is that something that is inherent in our genes when we're born? I really doubt it. I think it's a collective of the upbringing, not just what you say, although could play into it, and not just what papers and trust documents and this and that say. It's the actions that you do and the time you take to instill a level, in my opinion, of proper morals, etiquette, character. And this relates a little bit to, in the past, the matriarchy, birth through 18, being more hands-on in that process. Without proper character, how is the family going to thrive beyond that generation? Like, I think it's kind of impossible.
It's the age-old question, Angelo, of nature versus nurture. And to some extent, we are born with character and personality. And to some extent, probably a much larger extent, we are shaped by the friends that we have and the values that our family teaches us. And the reason that I say it's not all or nothing one way or another is because in families with multiple children, you see how the daughter has one personality and the son has a completely different personality, and they were brought up in exactly the same household. So there is some element of nature involved in addition to all of the nurture. But I do have 3 keys to raising children in an atmosphere of wealth. And number 1, we've already talked about, which is start while young. Perhaps not the 9-month-old joke that we were talking about earlier, but yes, it is never too early to start teaching your family's values, your family story, your family culture, even to little ones with a bedtime story over and over and over again. My second key, and it's one that you alluded to earlier, is model the behavior you want them to emulate. So if they see you talking down to people, if they see you behaving badly, that's the behavior they're going to emulate. Because as we all know, kids pay more attention to what you do than they ever will pay attention to what you say. So model the behavior you want them to exhibit. And my third key to raising children in an atmosphere of wealth is to find teachable moments, because they are everywhere, with the giant warning caveat that they are invariably at the least convenient or least opportune time. The old joke about, and this actually happened to a client of mine. She was online at the bank, back when you got online at the bank, which was obviously a long time ago. And she lived in a small town, and they were very well known in the town as being wealthy and philanthropists and all of this. And little Johnny tugs on her sleeve at the bank while they're online and says, "Mommy, are we rich?" And it was like that old E.F. Hutton commercial where everybody wanted to hear what the answer was going to be. And my best advice is don't fudge, because kids can spot a fudge a mile away. So what's a fudge? A fudge is, yes, we're rich because we have our health. Or, yes, we're rich because we love each other. Or, yes, we're rich because, mommy and daddy are still on our first marriage, and we're rich with love. Those are fudges. They may all be true, but that doesn't answer the question. It is entirely fair to say, Johnny, it is not a secret, but we don't discuss these things in public, and we'll have a conversation about it when we get home. And then you actually follow through and do have that conversation when you get home in age appropriate ways. But don't fudge, and don't forget to bring up the conversation, because they're waiting. And it's that old joke where, little Jimmy says, where do I come from? And everybody thinks little Jimmy's asking about the birds and bees conversation. So they sit him down and they teach him all about the birds and the bees. And they said, oh, that's really interesting, because, my classmate is from Cleveland. And so I was wondering where we're from. And so you sort of need to be age appropriate, and you need to answer the question that's being asked.
I'm fascinated, and I've done some of the work myself in family boards and committees with rising generation, probably potentially as young as early teens, maybe a little bit more late teens into even early 20s, effectively being an observer. So I'm going to call it a board or a committee observer, a little bit of learning to some degree how the sausage is made. The value that you see in, quote unquote, the verbiage observer, I go back to that question on age again, and I think it depends, it varies. But what work have you done, and what value have you seen, what we call in our community and in traditional boards and committee, of an observer?
I think it's a very powerful tool. And we talked about it a little bit earlier today, the notion of either a junior advisory council, or just having them attend the family board meetings or the family business board meetings. Have them participate in the conversation around the family dinner table when you're discussing the family business, and actually give them an opportunity to listen, to engage, to learn, and also to speak, because they may have a different point of view that may turn out to be really interesting and really valuable. So don't just say, shut up and listen, but actually encourage them to reflect back on what they're hearing and offer some input. And if it's a suggestion that you've already thought of, explain why it didn't work, so they can learn from that experience.
Financial wealth without purpose is a poor glue to keep families united and happy generationally. We know that. How do you define purpose? Is it an offshoot of culture? Is it different? And I'm asking two questions in one now. How do you help a rising generation discover their purpose?
Oh, I love those conversations, Angelo. So purpose is different from culture. Purpose is individual to each person. What do I want to be when I grow up? How do I want to impact the world? How do I want to make a difference in the world? Whether it's as a captain of industry, or a professional athlete, or a doctor, or something more modest. I worked with a family who basically said to their kids, as long as you are contributing to make the world a better place, we will support you no matter what that is. You can be a car mechanic. As long as you are the best car mechanic you can be, we will support that. There was another family I worked with. It was one of my favorite family meetings that I facilitated, because these parents were so forward thinking. Their children were about to go off to college. They had twins, and they were about to go off to college. And mom and dad said, we want to sit our kids down, and we're not going to bear the family balance sheet to them, because they don't have the emotional maturity to handle that. But what we want to do is explain to them that our estate plan provides that as long as they are doing something they love, that the estate plan will support that. And so as they head off to college and they start thinking about majors and what they want to to choose as their life's work, we want them to pursue something that follow their passion, because and have the freedom to know that we will support that. And as it happened, one of the kids wanted to go to film school, and another of the kids was actually a fine artist. And they were so relieved that they didn't have to join their father's venture capital fund, because that was just not where their passion was. And so they were so relieved to know that their parents were going to support who they were as humans. And so, yes, finding that purpose is what all young people, whether they are children of wealth or not, I think all young people who have who have satisfied at least the basic human needs of a roof over their head and knowing where their next meal is coming from and those sorts of things, the sense of purpose is often why we send our kids off to college, is to try different things in the arts and the humanities, and study philosophy and whatever it happens to be, to expose them to the greater world out there, and not just follow into mom's or dad's family business. And so, yes, I believe that developing and encouraging our children and our grandchildren to seek their own purpose, and to allow that can evolve over time. And so what you wanted to be, I don't know, an astronaut when you were 6 may not necessarily be what you want to be when you enter college, or even when you graduate college. It may be very different from what you wanted to be when you began college, and then later on in life. I mean, I'm in the 3rd chapter of my career, and it evolved organically over the course of time, and I couldn't be more fulfilled and have a greater sense of purpose in what I do now. I think I shared with you when we chatted, yay, it's Monday, because I love doing what I do. I love helping families navigate the morass of the intersection of family dynamics and family business.
Of course, I'm going to bring up another singular word, like purpose. I don't hear it spoken enough in family business in our community. And some will argue, there you go again, Angelo, you're a little bit archaic. I'm a little old-fashioned in certain ways. And that word is courage. To me, the importance of courage, how is it defined? We define it somewhat differently, but to me, it would be doing something in the face of fear and perhaps risk, and still, for the betterment, preferably of others and the unity, still moving forward. Sometimes inheritors, through upbringing or other factors, are a little bit, they're afraid of certain risks. I didn't make the money. I have the stewardship responsibility. And I think that does potentially create challenges. You'll sometimes see a bounce back in the 3rd generation that is maybe not beholden to a certain old school standards of so-called stewardship, but to you, and you may disagree and say it's not important at all. How important is it for rising generations to display and to be encouraged to be courageous?
Oh, that's a mouthful. I think that when people are young, they should be encouraged to step out of their safety zone, because that's how they experience life. And that's how they learn that they may actually enjoy and be good at things they never in a million years imagined they would be good at. So I'll give you a personal example. My first job out of law school, I was there a couple of months, and the partners at the law firm said, well, we're going to be putting on a series of seminars to talk about the new tax act that was coming out. And I had never done public speaking before. I was a bookish student who got A's and, had my nose in a book all the time. And when I think back now, I feel sorry for the audience, because I must have been awful. But they threw me in the deep end of the pool. And now I love public speaking. It is one of the things that I love almost more than anything else to do. I find it an opportunity to share information, an opportunity to educate, an opportunity to engage with others, and frankly, an opportunity to preach what I'm constantly reminding advisors to wealth, which is demonstrate to your clients consistently that you worry about what is keeping them up at night. And what's keeping them up at night is not their family office structure. And what's keeping them up at night is not their investments unless the market's having a particularly volatile day. And it's probably not their taxes unless they just got a letter from Uncle Sam. What's keeping them up at night is how do I raise my family in an atmosphere of wealth and have them turn out to be responsible, contributing, productive members of society. And so as advisors to those families, we as a community need to step up and demonstrate to these families that we care about what they care about, and not just lead with our pitch book and not just lead with our investment performance or the latest alphabet soup of grits, grats, and gruts in the estate planning world and slats and whatever, but actually lead with, tell me what's keeping you up at night, and not assume, and ask some questions and demonstrate that you're actually paying attention to what they care about. And that will lead you to ask, hopefully, more probing questions and then get to where that family needs to be, not as a cookie cutter approach, but as an individualized approach for that unique family. And so, yes, I think that the courage to step outside your comfort zone as a family, and frankly, also as an advisor, and not to stick with the same old, but to actually teach the younger members of your team to engage with the family and actually have those really uncomfortable conversations does take courage. So I'm very glad that you brought up that word.
I'm glad I brought it up. Another topic related to me, and some may think not necessarily, but I think it is, and that's critical thinking. You can't outsource as a family, in my opinion, creativity and the ability to think critically. Is part of that inherent with IQ? Sure. Is part of that inherent to, again, nature and nurture, upbringing, schooling? But there is going to be no generational wealth. I don't care what kind of trust structures you have, how good you are totally passively outsourced relationships and investing. Trust me, things will go wrong. And again, I know it's probably a little outside the purview, but for you, how do you help to foster critical thinking? For me, I'm a big believer in first principles thinking. And yes, I do think proper education, certain activities, and part of that relates to courage too, because you're going to be wrong, and the capability of facing the courage of being wrong, putting ego aside and learning from it, and the opportunities to adapt and move forward. Again, I started off maybe relatively simply. Now I'm doing a bombardment of complexity questions in one comment. So you're getting it pretty hardcore from Angela today, Susan.
Well, that's what makes this conversation so fun. And I can't argue. I think that parents can nurture critical thinking at even younger ages with their kids, whether it, as I mentioned earlier, maybe giving them an allowance and sort of the three jars, the give jar, the save jar, and the spend jar, and teaching them budgeting, that maybe they can't afford that app or that video game today, so they need to save up for it. And maybe they use some of their spend jar for immediate things like candy or whatever, but also teaching them the difference between wants and needs. And the things that you truly need, we as your parents will pay for, but the things that you want, we are going to encourage you to save up for them. And then, of course, the give jar, giving them the sense of the responsibility that accompanies their privilege. So that's one technique. But there are so many other opportunities. Again, model the behavior that you want your kids to emulate. So when you have a difficult decision to make, bring them in, and maybe, don't let them help a multi-million-dollar decision, but bring them in and share what your thinking is and encourage them to actually brainstorm a little bit and then provide them a safety net. So, because yes, of course, if you don't fail, then you don't learn. And so provide them that safety net so that they can fail and it won't be quite so devastating. So without a doubt, the notion of continual learning for the rising generation is so important to develop their understanding of things, because the world is moving so fast now. I mean, the world always moved fast, but now it's just warp speed. And giving them the tools to be able to, whether it's, deleting the come on from the prince on email who wants you to send him $10 million right away, or, those sorts of, or the ones that are a lot more subtle, and learning how to protect yourself in today's day and age. And the notion of, we haven't even touched on the notion of cybersecurity and the concept that maybe kids shouldn't be posting on Facebook that they're going to some foreign country with their parents, because then, number one, the house is vacant, and number two, maybe you're a kidnap risk depending on what country you're going to, and all sorts of 3, 4, and 5 other different potential risks. And just the notion of critical thinking in that regard, that maybe you don't share everything with the world. And the other big issue we haven't touched on is, how do I educate my kids, especially as they start forming relationships, whether it's friends or it's romantic relationships? How do they have the critical thinking to discern whether someone wants to be their friend because they genuinely like you, or they want to be your friend because you've got a famous last name and they get to go on your private jet or whatever it happens to be? And so those sorts of critical thinking elements become really important as children progress from adolescence into sort of dating age.
Be careful what you ask for, Susan. In the last 2 weeks, I've done 2 effectively 3-hour interviews. So there are certain things that are great subject, but in the essence of some level of time, we'll probably go to the bottom of the hour, which is an hour and a half, is still a hell of a long interview. But there are some subjects we'll save until the next time. But I will bring up some of the foundational work, what I call, well, others have called before me, capacity and capability, which relates to what you said. I would say foundationally, Jay Hughes probably spoke about this even 30 to 40 years ago, and other names by last name that you and I are going to know, Wesley, Stewart, and Schoenfeld as well, has spoken about capacity revolving around the underlying ability of the family to adapt to changing circumstances, and capability, the capability of understanding nuances, business, finance. Even if you don't want to go down that road in your career, you're less likely to, unfortunately, because you are a target, to be tricked by others, for lack of a better word. There is no continuity in the family without capacity and capability. And I may use this word another time a little later in a different context. There's going to be fragility, and certainly not anti-fragility of the family, if you don't secure that. There's going to be some heirs and others in Rising Gen that are listening to us. We're an hour and 3 minutes in and saying, wow, this is kind of a lot here. I'm kind of maybe even feeling a little nervous. How do we comfort them and make them understand things like we're talking about, which is, in my profile now, capacity and capability?
The number one way not to scare people off is to break any task down into small enough bites that are easily understood and easily accomplished. So Back when I was an estate planning lawyer, I would give clients sort of a laundry list of here's all the things we're going to do, but we're not going to focus on all of those today. Right now, let's focus on thing one. And if it takes a month, if it takes 6 months, or it takes 12 months, at some point, we're going to be done with thing one. We're going to cross it off the list, and then we can move on to thing two. And it's my job to integrate all of those. And it may take 5 or 10 years until we accomplish everything on the list, depending on you, Mr. and Mrs. Client. But we're going to focus on it in a methodical, intentional, thoughtful way. And it will be my job to coordinate all of the pieces so that step one doesn't conflict with step four unless you've had a change in your thinking, and then we can go back and revise step one. So the notion of people getting overwhelmed is a very common emotion. There's a lot to this. Look, we've talked for an hour and we've barely even scratched the surface. This is our collective life's work, and certainly Jay Hughes is the grandfather of thought in our area, and it certainly is his life's work. The notion of educating thoughtful, rising generations that have the tools and the empowerment to move ahead after the wealth creator is gone is a worthy endeavor, and it can be very intimidating. It is. It's not something that anyone was brought up knowing how to do. So yes, it's scary. And my way of dealing with any kind of daunting to-do list is to break it up into easily accomplished parts. And so yes, if a family is setting up a governance system, I'm not going to say to them, okay, here's your homework, go write a constitution and come back tomorrow. It's a long, engaged process where the facilitator asks the right questions to get the family thinking about things they've never thought about before, and talking, and even more important than thinking about things, talking about things they've never as a family talked about before. And as I like to say, the deliverable is really the process itself, not the document at the end of the day. So the process of engaging in those conversations, of thinking about generations who come after you, thinking about the issues that setting up a structure and a framework to address issues that you can't even envision today, but may arise at some point. And then the most important part of that framework is building in a capacity to adapt to change, because the world is changing, and the circumstances as they exist today will almost certainly not be the circumstances as they exist for the next generation. And so you need to provide them with the tools to make changes to that governance system as it's appropriate at that time.
Wow, does that segue very well into my comment question, which you kind of answered, but maybe give you a chance to expand on it, which relates to capacity and capability, which hopefully lead to, quote unquote, more anti-fragility than fragility. And that relates to something that I talk to families about, or family offices about, and it's emphasizing the value of preparing the family more so than protecting them. The greatest threat to the family is the family, but the greatest advantage the family has is the family. Their legacy, their story, their connections, their capital. There's a variety of different capital, including knowledge. It's going to be very tempting to only protect. And I'm not saying that's not a value, but without preparing, because we're in a fast-changing world, do you almost act or recommend in larger families with formally structured family offices, or act as an outsource? Let's go with the word chief learning officer.
That is one of the more fun parts of what I do, because that's not necessarily as conflict-laden as when there's a family crisis, and typically that is when I get brought in. But it is way more fun for me, honestly, when a family wants to get ahead of the curve and they're thinking about their governance structure, they're thinking about educating their children, their grandchildren, their nieces and nephews and whomever, but the financial education, the financial literacy, as well as the culture discussions, which we've alluded to. Who are we? What does it mean to be part of our family? And how is this wealth created? What's the story? And not just sort of the bedtime story, but let's dive in under the hood and actually know more about what happened. And to me, that's sort of the most interesting part of the family wealth community is the stories, the varied and diverse ways that wealth is created. To me is just fascinating. And I love hearing about it. I love talking about it. And I love getting families to talk about it, because whether it's, creating a storyboard where everybody in the family sort of contributes what they know about their heritage and then forming a cohesive story, or just the financial education of saying, okay, well, here's the family office report, and here's the balance sheet, and explaining what that means. Or maybe it's inviting the college student who's interested in finance into the meeting with the managers so that they can at least learn what kinds of questions you're asking and what kinds of responses, and again, that critical thinking of how you take it to the next level and how you drill down and then how you make decisions about that. And that's the only way that they're going to learn, is by being there and being participatory in the process.
I think we would have covered it in the hour and 10 minutes that we've done, but I'll ask it in a little different way and ask you to complete the sentence. There is no family continuity without, what would you say?
A plan. It's the old plan to fail or fail to plan. You need to think about what your family's going to look like after you're gone and have a plan for that. And look, I may be an outlier on this, but I don't enter into a family system with the notion that no matter what, the family has to stay together. And I know many advisors in my space do walk into a situation with that as a preconceived notion. There are many families where they do really well separating their interests so that they're not in a common investment vehicle, and they don't own that family vacation house together, and they don't own, they're not co-shareholders in the family business, because it can get ugly very, very quickly. And so I don't necessarily believe that every family has to stay together no matter what. That is not necessarily always the right answer. If it's the right answer for a particular family, then great, I can help them do that. But if it's not the right answer for a certain family, then that's also fine. I worked with a family, oh gosh, I think it was during the pandemic. And there was a common family investment vehicle. And they were having a challenge involving a commitment to stay invested in the common investment vehicle. And one of the siblings wasn't sure that that was going to be the right move for her. And so they brought me in to help facilitate a series of family meetings. And at the first group meeting, I said, because of course I held individual conversations with each stakeholder first, but at the first group meeting, the first question I posed was, what does the ideal outcome look like for you? And to a person, they all said, we want to be able to get together for holiday dinners because we are a family. And I said, I can work with that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we negotiated an exit or a buyout of one of the family members who just had a different point of view about the family business than everyone else. And in that way, that family member was free to be a family member without the stress of being a co-shareholder together with their family. And so I think that you do need to go in with an open mind as a consultant and not bring your own personal biases to bear, but actually hear what the family thinks the right answer is. And often the right answer is not necessarily what they tell you the first time you ask the question. Because
yeah, like my first week in the business.
And exactly. Because, people are people pleasers. They want to tell you what they think you want to hear, or what is their truth at the time may not really be their truth once you start chipping away at the iceberg. And so the notion that a one size fits all does not work in the family office space.
Building up into my next question, and I could have even titled our program today, Multi-Generational Resilience, Resilience Grit, the great work of professor and author Angela Duckworth, her book written, highly recommended. Overcoming challenges and obstacles, all of that relates to culture, to purpose, to courage, and other verbiage that I used. There are some people, and maybe surprised that our discussion didn't go in a traditional linear fashion. It wouldn't be an Angelo interview if it did, I promise you that. And talking about governance, first of all, I've covered it, although probably not enough, but with other also traditional people in the community. And I have a little different take on it, but it all relates back to the issue of kind of multi-generational resiliency. And I am an advocate. So what is family governance? It's about family members learning how to make better joint decisions together. We are not going to have the time to do a breakdown, and there is a value to that. What's a mission statement? What's a vision statement? What's a family constitution? What type of boards? What type of committees? Board observers. And we may disagree a little bit on this one, and it's okay. All of those are needed. They're all custom, and the family, and in my opinion, the rising generation has to be engaged in that process. Here's my problem. You're unique, given your legal, your accounting, and somewhat even more investment background compared to most people that do what you do. I'm not going to say they overemphasize what I just described, because it's very, very important. To me, culture is probably number one, but then you do have to, how we process information and how we make decisions is very important. But Susan, could I make the argument that there are certain elements in the industry and a comfort zone where it becomes overblown, overly complicated, overly hierarchical and full of bureaucracy, and that is going to be the antithesis of being able to maybe move quickly, to be able to be anti-fragile. There are some times where layers, hierarchy, never bureaucracy, of course, but do help to hedge against certain risks of not thinking things through. I'm not saying this is black and white. I am saying there are some in the industry that overcomplicate it. I don't want to put you in a bit of a tough position, so why don't I just simply get your opinion?
I think that's a fair comment, Angelo. There are there are some outfits in my industry that have more of a, shall we say, cookie cutter approach, where everybody gets a mission statement, a vision statement, a value statement, and a constitution. I don't think that's as prevalent as it used to be, and I'm very glad of that. Right. But I did work with a family that that had a family assembly, a family council, an annual family meeting, a family advisory board, you name it. Like the head of the family office read all the literature and just threw it all against the wall to see what would stick. And it wasn't that large a family. And it was I don't want to say it was silly, but it was unnecessary. It was, as you said, bloated is really the right answer. And ultimately, nobody really knew what all these entities were and did and responsible for. And at the end of the day, in that particular family, the patriarch ruled with an iron fist anyway. So the entire process was illusory and not, with no transparency. And so they had this structure because the head of the family office read a bunch of articles that had no teeth to it, because the patriarch was going to make all the decisions anyway until the day that he died. And so I am much more a believer in the notion that each family brings its own set of challenges and its own set of opportunities. And I help a family find its own right solution rather than coming into a new family system saying, here's what I'm going to do for you.
Correct. I may have a little bit of a bias. Sometimes, again, hierarchy is valuable. There is a little bit of a chain of command, for lack of a better word. I'm very sensitive to bureaucracy. Maybe like you, I've worked in gigantic public companies. I've known for decades the family office community and challenges among 2,000 single family offices over years that I've known and interacted with. There is nothing positive that comes from bureaucracy. Now, it's another subject with an upcoming guest this fall that we're going to cover. Susan, I think I'm down. We'll go round robin to my final 3 questions. If you were to meet, let's even use my family as the example. Some liquidity events. I have a newly minted 21-year-old son, so he's new to being officially an adult. And I wanted an hour and a half lunch with him. What would you, now, yes, you're going to give me the answer of, Angelo, unlike you, I'm going to have them talk and ask a question and let them flow. That's too easy. What would you potentially look to uncover? Because a lot of the young ones now are even unsure, even if they come from money, what their future. I'm thinking AI, I'm thinking globalization, I'm thinking highly competitive. Some of them have internal fears. What would you look to uncover in working with them to maybe guide or mentor them initially in the right direction?
We've already touched on it. The answer is helping them find their purpose, and their passion. What impact do they want to make on the world? What gets them excited? What gets their juices flowing? What gets them jazzed? Those are the kinds of questions I like to ask young people. I worked with a family not very long ago at all, where my mandate was to work with the younger generation, the 20-somethings, and help them uncover their purpose and be a resource to them so that they could become the best them imaginable. And so again, whether it's someone who wants to be a captain of industry or a sports store or a professional chef, it doesn't matter. Be the best you that you can be, and let's help figure out what that looks like. And it doesn't mean that it's chiseled in stone and you can't pivot at some point in the future. But right now, what's interesting to you? What impact do you want to make on the world? Because as a child of wealth, you have the flexibility to actually think about making an impact on the world. What do you want that to look like? Is it going to be global? Is it going to be local? Are you going to volunteer for charities and not just write checks? What do you want that to look like? And so those are the kinds of questions I would engage in with your 21-year-old son.
Now I know that lunch may be upcoming. This is a question, and I know we only had an hour and a half. What question should I ask, or maybe rephrased, what question maybe you're rarely asked that you think is valuable that you would love to answer? So you're going to kind of ask your own question and answer it.
Well, the question I get asked a lot is, what's the purpose of a family meeting? And why should we do that? I actually lost a piece of business once to a family with a very famous last name, who basically, they all interviewed me separately. They decided they were going to go with me. And then at the end of the day, they said, do we really even need a family meeting? And at the time, I didn't have the right answer for them. But when I think about family meetings now, I think about it like the old journalism approach of, who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so I like to start with the why. Why are we doing a family meeting? Why are we engaging in a family governance discussion? Why should I invest my time, my emotional capital, my financial capital by hiring a consultant, in engaging in travel to a meeting place and whatever homework is involved and all of these different factors? Why should I do all of that? And the answer is everything we've talked about in this past almost hour and a half, which is perpetuating who we are as a family. What is our family identity? What is our family culture? And establishing the sort of all of that so that you do avoid the proverbial shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, so that you can equip future generations with a sense of their place in the world, a sense of self, and a sense of hopefully responsibility that accompanies their privilege. So that's the big why. The next question is what? And what is a family governance structure? And I'll start answering that question with what it is not. A family governance structure is not the will and the trust and the foundation document and the all the other legal documents. Those memorialize what the family governance system is, and those memorialize what the family culture is. But those are not the end result. As I said, the real deliverable is the process itself. The what is sitting around a table and duking it out and talking about all of these issues that we've never talked about in our lives as a family because money was this deep, dark secret that, great-grandfather told us never to talk about because it was gauche. And so that's the real what in family meetings and sort of diving down into who are we as a family. The how is an interesting one. So some families who do regular family meetings meet once a year, or if there's a critical issue, it might be more often. It's certainly not a one and done. And one of the things I like to encourage families to do is to endow some fund so that the annual gathering, whether it's a reunion or it's a family meeting or whatever, that the family members have a fund that will pay for their travel expenses. I worked with a family that was a very well-known family, and the patriarch refused to pay for his offspring's travel expenses to the family meeting. And we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. But he controlled the purse strings, and they were living relatively modestly, and he refused to pay for their travel to the family meeting. And, it was just unimaginable to me that you're going to insist that they attend. Attendance is mandatory, and it was financially challenging for them to do it, and he wasn't going to open his wallet to pay for their plane fare and their hotel. It was just fascinating to me. So endow that chair for the annual gathering. Endow that fund for the upkeep of the family vacation compound, because if the roof leaks, do you really expect 10 or 15 or 20 people to kick in 10 grand each in order to fix the roof? You need to...
A nice roof, I might add.
Well, I'm just saying, if it's a family vacation compound, then yeah,
it could
probably a very nice roof. Yes. So yeah, that all of those sorts of things, and create a fund for all of that, and also create if there's a family vacation compound, and I know I'm getting a little off on a tangent here, but the families fall apart over that almost more often than almost anything else. Who gets Christmas week at the ski house? Who gets the prime week in August at the lake house? Who gets to redecorate and pick what color the curtains are? It and the list goes on. Are we going to use Antilles china, or are we going to use whatever? It's a never ending source of family discontent. So yeah, that's the how. The is make it easy for everyone to attend, make it easy for everyone to participate, remove the barriers that you can remove, because there's going to be enough barriers anyway. The next journalist question that is probably the hardest one, which is why I saved it for second to last, is who? Who gets invited to the family meetings?
Yeah.
And very often, families will say to me, well, it's mom and dad and both kids, and that's it. It's just our bloodline. And when our grandkids get older, they'll get invited too. But as we talked about earlier, the spouses of your children are the parents of your grandchildren. So don't exclude them from these big picture conversations about who your family is. And we also talked about giving the rising generation a seat at the table, and perhaps a younger age, then maybe they will have a vote, but include them so that they can listen and learn and contribute and feel part of it all. And so it may be on an age appropriate basis, or maybe when everybody gets to be a teenager, they get to come. I don't know. Every family is different, but at least consider the concept of who gets invited to those things. And limiting it to only the bloodline is not necessarily the right answer. And then the last journalism question is the when. And we've already talked about the when being that, the best time to start was last week or last year or even yesterday, but you can't do that. So start today and do it on a consistent basis. So don't have it be one and done. Whether it's a family meeting or you're drafting a family constitution, don't sign it, have a big signing ceremony, then stick it in the drawer and let it gather dust. But resolve that every 2 or 3 years, or even 5 years, but preferably more frequently than that you review it and see if it still makes sense for the family, or if there have been substantive changes in the family. Either there have been marriages, divorces, births, deaths, job changes, moves across the country or across the world. There's a host of different huge changes in wealth, a big liquidity event, or whatever. All of those sorts of things will require a review, and not necessarily an amendment, but at least a review. Does this still make sense and still work for us as a family?
Yeah, there's a checklist process that I go through often with the family office that also relates and covers that. Last question, and let's even keep it 1 minute. And I believe we kind of, from your perspective, answered it, but the 1 minute will make it succinct. And that question is pretty simple. What would you like these families to know?
Oh, I can answer that in one question. So in 1 minute. So my favorite quote on this topic comes from George Bernard Shaw, who famously said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And so what I would like every family to take away from this, if nothing else, is not to pretend that you're an ostrich and that the world doesn't exist and the world of wealth doesn't exist, but actually have regular communication with your family about the things that you want them to know and the things they would like to know from you.
Excellent. Susan, I don't know what to say. This has been great. The hour and 36 minutes feel like it flew by. There's topics like family conflict and other issues that we'll have to save to the next time that are very important. I think this was wonderful. Hopefully the audience greatly enjoyed it. And for those that would like to learn more about you, and I highly recommend it, audience, where they could follow you, LinkedIn or X or both, and how they could learn more about your practice and your consultancy through your website and contact info.
Thank you. So I have 2 websites. My consulting website is WLA, as in Wealth Legacy Advisors, LLC. So WLALLC.com. That's my consulting website. I also have a separate speaking website, which is SusanSchoenfeld.com.
And please spell your last name.
SCHOENFELD.
And would you like for people to know that they can follow you on LinkedIn X or any of the platforms that you use?
Yes, I am out there. I regularly post thought pieces on LinkedIn. I post monthly thought pieces. I also post them on my consulting website, I have a publications tab. So you can find me any number of ways, but feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. Feel free to go to my website and hit the contact page. I'd love to hear from you.
Wow, this was great. Audience, I really love this conversation on how to incorporate next gen across the enterprise. I'll probably perhaps make it somewhat of a quarterly series. Give me feedback if you all would like for me to do that. And yes, as I noted earlier, I'm probably most active on single family office issues, from structuring. My real love is best practices, excellence in the family office, being the top 1%. I got a masterclass called that. I love geopolitics. I love macroeconomics and investing and tying that in. We all have our strengths. All of that falls apart for the continuity in the family if it's not for the strength of culture, purpose, and the issues and governance and how decisions are made that we're talking about today. There's a reason why my newer compared to me being the founder and longtime CEO that I sold, the Family Office Association, my new group, which is far more intimate and bespoke, is called SFO Continuity. Really should be family and SFO continuity, the emphasis on that word. So those of you that do not follow me, I have two YouTube platforms. My larger one is simply @FamilyOffice. My newer branded one, and they each sometimes have slightly different content, is Family Office TV. Simply go to YouTube and subscribe. I do a lot of interviews. Arguably, I push some boundaries, but that makes it exciting. You want me to talk about some of these things, trust me. And hopefully they're value that I'm giving and giving back for effectively free to the community. The joke that I like to make is Susan's awesome, and rightfully so. She charges for what she does. I feel like I got an hour and a half of a complimentary consultative work. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you for having me, Angelo. I had a lot of fun.
I'm just curious myself, and the opportunity of learning. I want to learn every day, and Susan has so much to teach that I've been so fortunate. To learn more, follow me on social media. Go to angelorobles.com, where also there's information on my membership services at SFO Continuity. I hope you're all having a great summer. Definitely follow and reach out to Susan. I look forward to the next one. Susan, thank you so much, and have a great remainder of the summer.
Thanks so much, Angelo.
My pleasure.